This episode is sponsored by Peopleware, a pioneer in workforce management for over 30 years. But more on that later. Hi, Chris. Welcome back one more time. How are you
Hello, Andre.
doing?
Thanks for having me.
Thanks a lot. So, you have been with us on multiple episodes. Today, I think we have a subject that we actually spoke about this a few times, but I think it's always a subject that is on everyone's mind, which is related with KPIs and how to really create an impact on workforce management.
Very true.
Which I think it's a very interesting topic. Luckily enough, you have written a lot across your career about this subject, so I couldn't be more excited to have you here today with us. Chris, so let me start with a simple one. So we mentioned about KPIs. KPIs have been part of our workforce management. In every single corner, there is a KPI to monitor something.
Yes.
I would ask you, why are KPIs so essential? Not only specifically on workforce management, but I think in general across every single area. We can talk it about operations. We can talk about planning. So why are KPIs so essential in your opinion?
Yeah, good question, Andre. And I think our listeners probably know the axiom: if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And that sometimes gets attributed to Peter Drucker, the management scientist. And if you can't measure it, you can't manage it, is a reminder that you need to constantly measure the vital signs of your business, whatever kind of business it is, so you can track performance against your targets. Now, that comparison with target is critical. It doesn't just mean that if you don't hit your target, you've got to beat yourself up. It means you need to drill into why it went wrong so you can constantly improve. I remember Paul Smedley of the Forum used to say, planning is where numbers meet people. That was a pretty good saying, I thought. Planning is definitely a numbers game, and you can measure and benchmark your performance as a planner with some very revealing KPIs like forecast accuracy and schedule efficiency. And as you mentioned, Andre, the same is also true for operations in the contact center. So as well as customer service goals like, the very popular one, service level, you need goals for things like after call, work time, idle time, cost per call, things like that.
I think you started us quite well. Like, if we can't measure it, how the hell do we move around it? So I think that let me start there on. So when we think about workforce management, let's start here in particular. It's very often, like you said, everyone has kind of like a predefined idea of what a KPI in industry standards should look like.
Yeah.
How do you think organizations should actually handle it? Like, should they aim and just go for the standard industry standard metrics in KPIs, or should they align their KPIs to a certain extent to their unique goals, and maybe a target for a very similar KPI might be different or slightly adjusted in the formula just to make sure that we are measuring the right thing? What's your take on that?
Yeah, well, Andre, I'm a simple, practical guy, and I'm not going to get all philosophical about this, but you really have got to start with KPIs, with a clear picture of your organization, the values, brand, and goals. The KPIs you choose have got to be aligned with your business model, and the target levels have got to be aligned too. I'll give you an example. I don't want to say anything judgmental about Ryanair, the low fares airline, but I'm guessing that Ryanair doesn't set very ambitious goals for service level. And I'm guessing that they keep an eye on average cost per contact and try and keep it down. So Ryanair isn't about a superior customer experience. It's about keeping the price of the product down by cutting costs to the bone. And Ryanair's customers get that. It's an expectation of the service. Similarly, if you're operating in a highly competitive market with many alternative suppliers, maybe insurance, something like that, abandoned calls mean lost business. So you probably want to make abandonment rate KPI if that's what your business looks like. I know most of our business to consumer customers in the retail and entertainment sectors set really aggressive targets for abandonment because they know that abandoned calls mean lost business. Now, it may not be obvious what your organization's vision, values, and brand are, but you can usually find them in the induction pack that new employees get during onboarding. They may be in your company's annual report. They might be in your corporate playbook, but it is important to find out what they are and make sure the KPIs are aligned with them.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to in the end, what's your goal? If you have a clear sense of what the goal you want to achieve,
Yeah,
KPIs will naturally flow around getting you a step closer to achieve that goal.
exactly. They've
I think that would be
got to be meaningful for your organization. Yeah,
exactly. I couldn't agree more. So let me just I mentioned this that you wrote a lot of pieces on this. I'm going to mention a particular ebook you did on multiple KPIs across the industry. I
thanks
think
for
you
the plug
highlighted
on that.
35.
Yeah,
We can cover all. I think specifically the ones I would like to kind of like shed a bit more of light will be around planning and operational efficiency,
yeah,
if effectiveness. But I think in the end of the day, when we think about KPIs and how critical they are, there are always things that come to mind.
yeah,
And let me start with planning, because planning we have always had forecast accuracy,
yeah,
schedule efficiency. Those are the two probably most critical KPIs everyone speaks for planning effectiveness. But
yeah,
can you walk us through how each is measured, like
mm,
especially these ones that are slightly more important, and what kind of impact they have on
yeah.
on your contact center operations when properly monitored and there is actually work put into it?
Great, happy to do that, Andre. Yeah, so well, let's start. You mentioned forecast accuracy. Let's start with that first. So, I often ask people, how accurate their forecasts are, and most people quickly give me an answer like, we're normally 95% accurate, something like that. But when you drill into it, you find that different people measure accuracy in different ways, and some ways are better than others. So, measuring forecast accuracy sounds really simple. It sounds like a number you come up with like 95%, but there are some pitfalls to watch out for. So, a couple of tips. First, don't measure accuracy in weekly or monthly totals. Now, why do I say that? In any given week, there'll be hours when the actual volume was above the forecast, and there'll be other hours where it was below. And if you compare the forecast total with actual total, those differences are just going to cancel each other out, and you'll go away with a rosy picture about your accuracy that isn't realistic. It's going to be a bit too optimistic. So what you've got to do is to compare forecast with actual at each interval, the 50 and the 30-minute intervals that we use in planning, and then aggregate those differences to create a score. Now, there's several ways to do that. If you're a statistics nerd, I'm a bit of a statistics nerd, and there's a thing called the standard deviation you could use. There's correlation coefficients. Problem is, those measures are fine if you are a statistics nerd, but the typical contact center manager won't know what to do with the correlation coefficient, and perfectly reasonably, you could say. So I'd recommend a technique called mean absolute percent error, or MAPE. So it's lots of things on Google about that, something on the Peopleware blog about it. So you basically take the error percentage at each of those intervals, 50-minute intervals, whatever, remove the plus and minus sign. So 5% under or 5% over both count as a 5% error. And then you take the average of those percentages for a complete day or a complete week or the period you're trying to measure. And that's how you should measure percentage accuracy. Now, as I said, there are some great posts about that on the Peopleware blog. If you've not heard of Peopleware, we were talking about this earlier, Andre. It's the artist formerly known as injixo, but we had a rebranding. It's Peopleware. Just visit blog.peopleware.com and search for MAPE, but there's plenty of other articles about it. Another tip is don't forget to measure the accuracy of average handling time as well as volume, because both affect your workload. And the final tip about forecast accuracy is, we should be striving for 95% accuracy. It's a good rule of thumb, but don't beat yourself up if you don't hit it. The most important thing about forecasting is that it leads to the right outcomes. So even if it's 80% accurate, but leads to the right decisions about scheduling or hiring, whatever, that's good. But over time, try to get to 95%. So hopefully that's covered the forecast accuracy bit, Andre. So
Yeah, I think totally. Should we speak briefly? I have a question on forecast accuracy. Let me know if you want to go there first or if we should move to schedule efficiency.
okay, yeah, go ahead with the forecast one.
So, a quick question, and maybe this is not an easy one,
Okay,
but it's very commonly that everyone aims to achieve a very high forecast accuracy. But
yeah.
there are pitfalls, there are common challenges, there are things that are tricky. Do you have any tip on how teams can overcome those challenges on really getting that high forecast accuracy?
Yeah, I mean, it is tough. I mean, it's about setting a goal and striving to improve. And even if we never reach 95%, that's not necessarily the end of the world. I think we're going to come back to some reasons why forecasts are inaccurate. And there are always headwinds when it comes to forecasting. In fact, there are always headwinds in workforce management, but there are always things trying to blow us off course when it comes to forecasting. So things like, the old chestnut is, marketing run campaigns without bothering to tell, the planning team. They're using new technology that were never used before, or finding that social media is incredibly noisy. So there are always things that stop us getting there. I say, don't beat yourself up if you can't get to 95%, but always strive to improve. I think that's the main thing.
I totally agree with that. And I think if you allow me just to add one thing, I think the other piece on forecast accuracy, that is actually something that I think some people don't do is, and you said it quite well, monitor that at the interval level,
Yeah.
but do it frequently. Some people just do it like on weekly basis,
Mm.
bi-weekly, monthly, because that's somehow how the process are set up. I think it's just important to be as on top of it as any other metrics, because in the end of the day, that's will build your effective plan. So let's go to scheduling, and specifically
Yeah.
on efficiency, schedule efficiency. What do you have to say about it?
Yeah, I mean, last time we did a podcast together, Andre, I made a bit of a provocative statement that forecasting is all very well, but by itself, it's worthless. Shocking, I know. But by that, I meant if you don't use the forecast as an input to the capacity planning process or as an input to the scheduling process, then what's the point of doing it? So I'm a big fan of scheduling. And in my humble opinion, scheduling, particularly optimized scheduling, is where most of the magic happens in workforce management. And I'm always surprised when planners have their forecast accuracy metric at the fingertips, but they haven't measured schedule efficiency, because I think it's probably even more important. I mean, schedule efficiency is sometimes called workload fit. It's measuring how closely the scheduled supply of agents matches the forecast demand for agents. And that's the goal of scheduling, to match supply and demand consistently across time, even with the peaks and troughs, the M curve and what have you. And just like with forecasting, it's good practice to measure schedule efficiency at interval level, just like in the same way, and then aggregate those results again using something like mean absolute percent error. In fact, all the tips I mentioned for forecast accuracy apply to schedule efficiency as well. But you're measuring, instead of the accuracy of the forecast, you're measuring sort of the accuracy or the efficiency of the schedule, comparing supply and demand.
And I think having those quite well will set up everyone in terms of operations to actually be more efficient and more on top of like the overall
Yeah,
demand. It's like back to the supply and demand mix. So let me bridge what you just said on. So we spoke about, I would say, the traditional planning effectiveness KPIs. There are a few more than when you start to get more granular, as important. This is hard to say one is more important than the others, but like when we look into operational effectiveness, we have a
yeah,
lot of like things like handling times after call hours. I think you mentioned those as well.
yeah.
But how do we improve overall operational performance? What's your take on like what KPIs should contribute the most there, and which ones would you recommend to be on top of?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to operational effectiveness, as I'm sure everybody knows, I mean, AHT is a big one. So, as I'm sure everybody knows, average handling time measures the total time an agent takes on average to handle a call or contact. It includes talk time or writing time and any after-call work. Workload is the number of hours of work that needs to be done. It's the result of multiplying volume by AHT. So the general rule is, if you can reduce AHT, you'll reduce the workload, reduce the staffing requirement, give better customer service, and reduce the number of agents you need. So it's a good idea to keep an eye on AHT, but the devil's always in the details, more to it than that. You can't drive down AHT without potentially impacting quality. And that can literally be a matter of life and death in the emergency services or something like that. If your agents are selling high value products, do you really want them to spend less time reducing AHT, but spend less time with hot prospects and closing fewer deals? So it's a two-edged sword. But when it comes to AHT, you should benchmark it. And what do we mean by that? I mean, use the average handle time of one of your top performers as a standard. Find the agents who are perfectly balancing, controlling AHT with quality. Won't necessarily be the agent with the shortest AHT. He could be the one whose AHT is 10% longer than the team average, but they get the best quality scores or sales figures that are 20% better than the team average. So I think that's an important operational measure.
Power meets intelligence with peopleware. Their expertise WFM Suite seamlessly integrates with leading contact center platforms, helping businesses make smarter decisions, boost productivity, and maximize return on investment. With a mobile-oriented agent portal, employees have self-service at their fingertips. Make workforce management effortless. By combining the power of our people and AI intelligence, Peopleware helps organizations optimize their workforce management from start to finish. Yeah, and I like what you said because in the end of the day, this is all time and volume. In the end of those are the two most important metrics, and the things revolve around it. But I
Yeah,
think you added a layer of quality on, and if we go back in one of the first things we were discussing is really what makes unique your organization, and how do you
yeah,
adapt the goals consequently to what the goals really is and what we're trying to achieve.
yeah. Couldn't agree more.
Chris, within this realm of operational effectiveness, there is also some lesser known KPIs.
Mm,
Some of them you wrote on the ebook
yeah,
that you believe that are also crucial. Should we have a quick run over? But how
absolutely.
often do we overlook and watch which KPIs are those?
Yeah, happy to do so. I mean, you mentioned the ebook 35 KPIs. I'm absolutely not advocating that everyone should use 35 KPIs. And in fact, I use the axiom if you can't measure it, you can't manage it already. The reverse is not true. So if you can measure it, you should manage it, is the philosophy that might arise if we're not careful. So just because you can easily get some data to calculate a KPI, that doesn't mean you should focus on that KPI. As you said, Andre, the starting point is what are the organization's goals, what are its values, and then you measure the important KPIs that drive those outcomes. So that said, there are some lesser known KPIs that are probably worth exploring that maybe not everybody uses. So first response time is a good one. So that's the average minutes or hours between a customer submitting a case and a contact center agent responding. It's particularly relevant to modern digital channels and things like support tickets in the CRM system, which are increasingly important. Another good one is call transfer rate. It's about how often calls need to be transferred to other departments or agents. It's kind of another way of measuring first contact resolution, and actually it's measuring the same customer experience, and it might be easy to get the data for call transfer rate. Another little used one is average idle time. It measures the time that an agent is available but not handling a contact, and it's the inverse of occupancy, and it can be quite revealing. Average idle time. Longest waiting call or contact. That indicates the maximum time, obviously, customers spent waiting in the queue. Can be a bit scary because the longest waiting call can be a real outlier in the tail of the distribution, but it does put the customer perspective in sharp focus. And the final one that maybe doesn't get the airtime it deserves is cost per contact. I mean, that can be quite revealing, but it is dangerous to use it in isolation. You should always look at the cost alongside the important metrics like first contact resolution, net promoter score, average handling time, so you don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, horrible English expression, while trying to reduce costs.
And I think that helps to put things into perspective, because if we get just one single KPI, it will most likely not tell the whole story.
Yeah,
So there is
exactly.
always like a mixed bag, things that we should balance there. So let me, you mentioned quality a few times. You are actually mentioned as well satisfaction on the customer side, and kind of like this balance between both ends, between each organization as well as the customer on the other end, which depends a lot on the
Yeah,
market. And like you said, if it's in healthcare and it's emergency services, probably the sense of urgency will be slightly different
yeah,
that for instance in sales.
yeah,
But how can call centers really use KPIs beyond just measuring? Which I think you made a good point about. If you have the data,
yeah,
you can measure it, but
yeah,
what really does it really drive improvements in your organization? So
yeah.
how do you think that balance between service quality, employee satisfaction, what organization KPIs they want to measure, how can the organizations go
Yeah.
beyond just simply measuring, but really driving the right meaningful impacts? Do you have a take on that?
Yeah, good point. I mean, a bit like forecasts, KPIs are meaningless unless you do something meaningful with them. So, we already discussed forecast accuracy, and you should use forecast accuracy, the result of your forecast accuracy measure, as a driver to investigate root causes. So the forecast gets more and more accurate each time around the workforce management cycle. But that same thinking applies to all KPIs. So let's take service level. I mean, that's a KPI that nearly every contact center tracks, right? I mean, if you don't hit your service level goal, you need to find out why you didn't hit it. Was it because the forecast was inaccurate? Were there anomalies like those marketing campaigns I mentioned earlier that you didn't add as business intelligence into the forecast? Did you schedule the right number of people with the right skills? Did lots of them call in sick? Or was your estimate of shrinkage wrong? And if you got shrinkage wrong, how did that happen? And so on. So it should be, that simple measure of service level should, if you're not hitting it, lead to a whole series of questions. And there's a technique called 5 whys analysis. I guess you heard of it, Andre, but it's worth Googling that. The idea is to keep asking why until you find the actual root cause. Service level, you didn't hit it. There's any number of reasons why that could be true. I mean, customer satisfaction scores are also a KPI that you can't necessarily take at face value. I mean, what does a low CSAT score actually mean? It could be because the contact center did a bad job of handling the customer's query. They had to wait a long time, or the customer had to be put on hold or transferred before the problem could be solved. And those things should be driving improvements in the contact center, like better workforce management practice or better cross-training. But in reality, I think everybody can relate to this. A bad customer satisfaction score or a low net promoter score could just be the customer venting frustration with the organization's products and services, even though the contact center did a great job. So I think that's something everyone can relate to.
When we think about that balance and really what matters, there is another important factor which for certain professions it's hard to influence, but to a certain extent I think it's everyone's responsibility. Is when we build a strategy that is KPI driven, it's very important to have a very clear understanding of what those KPIs are and what strike the proper balance between all parts, because I think it's very easy to fall into unrealistic targets that then can be harmful to the organization into the
absolutely.
From your experience, what are some of the practical steps that teams should look into when they really want to drive this kind of KPI driven strategies? What would be some of the practical steps they should follow, in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of practical steps, there's a number of things. And again, thanks for mentioning the KPI ebook. If people don't know where it is, just go to the peopleware.com website, go to resources, and you'll find it there. So, yeah, I mean, you've got to start by defining your objectives. So, that could be, what is most broken? Where are we most deviating from our targets, and focus on that first. I mean, that could be improving customer satisfaction, could be reducing staff turnover, could be reducing costs, whichever one it is. Then you've got to choose KPIs that help you track performance against that objective. Now, one little tip, I think we mentioned this in previous discussions, Andres, don't overdo it with the KPIs. So Ian Robertson of the forum told me about a paper called The Magical Number 7, ±2, by a psychologist, George Armitage Miller. I mean, the executive summary of that paper is, the typical human working memory can only hold 7 facts. So if you're tracking dozens of KPIs, you're almost certainly wasting effort. You've also got to take human nature into account. Once you realize that you can't achieve all your KPI goals, it's human nature to focus on the easy ones and neglect the difficult ones, regardless of which are the most important. So, that's bear that in mind. Another little practical tip is, KPI targets have got to be realistic. I think you mentioned that already, Andre. I mean, there's no point trying to improve first contact resolution from 50% to 90% overnight. That's just not achievable. It's demotivating.
Yeah.
KPI targets also shouldn't be one size fits all. I mean, you can't expect new starters to have the same AHT as agents have been here for years, and they're falling and they're really experienced.
And I think it goes back not only balancing the employee experience to the customer satisfaction, but what you just said is actually a balance on the workforce. So it's really zooming, trying to create different buckets of what you should measure against what, and really try to tailor to maximize your goals. I think that's different. We have been saying that a lot, which is when you really know what you are trying to fix, get all the things around it. And sometimes it's small things in different buckets, but that will basically move the cogs to actually make a more meaningful impact.
Just one thing that crossed my mind is there's another trap to watch out for with KPIs, and that is don't fall into the trap of using industry standard targets. Like, how many people have an 80% in 20-second call handling goal, service level goal of 80/20, because it's just sort of industry standard in inverted commas. 80/20 isn't based on science. It's just based on, what happened in the dawn of call centers when 3 rings on the US telephone network lasted 20 seconds, and 80% not sounded like a reasonable goal, like in Pareto analysis. But, best practice is to choose a service level goal that's appropriate for the business you're in. 20 seconds is probably too long in emergency services. But in other cases, there's plenty of evidence that says that customers are prepared to wait, 40 seconds a minute if they get their problem resolved, efficiently at the end of that. Obviously, 40 minutes is unacceptable. I'm thinking about you, HRC. But yeah, don't go for the industry standard ones just because everybody else is doing it. It might not be suitable for you.
I think that's a very good recommendation. It's not, we can't run from the future, and I think the future is here. And we spoke about this in the past, and I think this digital age transformation is bringing new trends, new technologies, which is influencing a lot KPIs
Yeah.
and how we measure it. If you allow me, let me open the door with one, which I think that it's very important, which is concurrency. So concurrency has become like a very important factor that plays into KPIs, because multiple channels, different channels that have concurrent handling times and treatment.
Yeah.
I would love to have your thoughts on like how these new trends and technologies are actually shaping the way we look at KPIs, and which KPIs to a certain extent.
Yeah. I mean, very, very topical, and it's not going to go away. So, I mean, I've worked with call centers almost since they were invented in the 1990s. That's why I've got all this grey hair. But for at least 25 years, I've heard predictions about the death of the phone call. And we know that people from the millennial generation, the Gen Z generation, hardly ever make phone calls. When they have a mobile contract, they're not interested in minutes, they just want data. And, that's what happens when you've got digital natives who prefer self-service to communicating in text. But to borrow an idiom from Mark Twain, reports of the death of the phone call have been exaggerated. One thing we know is that call volumes are in decline. Digital channels like live chat and social media are on the rise. But coming to KPIs, ironically, the KPIs that you need to track for digital channels are pretty much the same as they are for calls. I mean, I looked at the ebook, 35 most important call center KPIs, and nearly all of them apply to digital channels as well as calls. Now, that doesn't mean that the planning team is just business as usual, because there are a few observations that I'd like to make about the growth of digital channels. I mean, first of all, chatbots and AI, the latest thing, things like that, they can now take care of all the simple everyday inquiries like, balance requests, payments, and things like that. And as a consequence, the queries that don't get captured by the chatbots are going to be more complex. Customers will still expect those queries to be handled efficiently by a human agent. And that means planners need to focus more than ever on the KPIs like first contract resolution rates. Low FCR indicates that we may need to do more product training for these more complex problems. Secondly, AHT is going to remain as an important KPI. And that's because it's going to likely increase and become more volatile, more variable. It's because queries that self-service can't handle are more complex and more diverse. So we need to track AHT even more carefully and do that root cause analysis we were talking about to find out the reason for any increases and then take correcting action. That could be making product changes or updating the self-service functions or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that is even more complex. You mentioned chatbots, which I think it's when we look at the landscape for the next 5 years, and I think I'm probably overstating. I don't things change so fast that I don't even know if in 5 years will be the same. But one thing that is very important is now you have your, like you said, more complex queries going to your workforce, which basically comes with challenges and more volatile. But then you have all the more simplistic stuff probably handled by a bot, which each bot has their own HTs, they have their own process time. So there is another layer of things you need to monitor, and there are risks because they might fall. One of the things that was building a plan a while back, which was we were building a contingency plan. So let's say if our automations are down for 24 hours, what's life what does life look like? Is it just chaos and we get swamped by cases? And certain organizations have very high levels of automation,
Yes.
probably 50% plus or more, but really having a good grasp of your bots, what they are doing, what's the digital HT,
Yeah.
and I think mainly for workforce management, when you plan, and this is a recommendation I would say to everyone, is plan your traditional workforce, but add a layer which is what's my digital workforce doing,
Yes.
and eventually we'll see, okay, my digital workforce translates into 10 15 FTEs
Yeah.
if they stop, so I need to have that, because if anything breaks, I need to report that back to the leadership teams. And I think that would be my recommendation on really adapting. And there's another layer into your
Yeah.
planning routines that you should on board. I don't know if you want to compliment Chris.
No, that's a great tip, Andre. I would say one thing, one KPI does we haven't really talked about, which probably deserves a mention before we wrap up. And we've talked about bots and automation and self-service, which is great, and it's going to become more dominant. But I think there'll always be people involved at some stage. And there's an old saying in the world of customer service: happy employees mean happy customers. And so if agents are getting stressed out and burned out, they're not going to deliver a great customer experience. And that's why another important KPI has been and will continue to be occupancy rate. So occupancy is, as I'm sure everybody knows, is the percentage of an agent's logged in time that is spent on contact-related activity. And if you get that going above 95%, that's a recipe for burnout. So I think occupancy is an important KPI that will all, whatever human beings are involved, we need to keep track of that.
And helps to strike a good balance. I agree. Chris, we are getting close to the end. I would love to close on final thoughts. So we
Yeah.
discussed loads of things on KPIs,
Yeah.
finding the right balance for the organization. I will just add one thing, and I will pass the word to you, which is one of the most important things that I learned from my experiences. Many times within WFM, we might have the right data, we might have the right KPIs.
Yeah.
We don't do necessarily a good job on showcasing those KPIs. So I think visualization of that data is very important. Traditionally, we probably are swamped with data tables and things like
Yeah.
that. But like getting more creative, really showing, like, for instance, one of the ones that I think it's had a lot of impact is showing shrinkage and absentees in dollars,
Mm,
pounds, whatever currency you are in, because
yeah.
really that strikes in a very important message. So if you get like a totally out of control absenteeism issue or attrition
Yeah.
issue, that comes with a cost.
Yeah.
Sharing that with your organization so they understand, okay, fixing this problem will help us in a certain amount, that helps. Which other things are just making visually waterfalls, whatever it is, really
Yeah.
showcasing your data in a different way. I think that would be my final tip, which I think helps enhance the quality of the KPIs and what they can be used for decision making.
Definitely.
Chris, your final thoughts here.
Yeah, I mean, sort of going back to what we said at the start, I mean, KPIs are great, but they are not an end in themselves. We only have them to drive improvements. And, you can use techniques like 5 whys, which we mentioned, 5 whys analysis to find root causes of underperformance so you can constantly be improving. Because, as you said, Andre, there are consequences, multiple consequences of not hitting KPIs.
That's a very good way to end today. So everyone out there building their own strategy, revising their KPIs, please, I hope you think about this, striking this right balance so you can
Yeah.
get a bigger impact on your organization. Chris, thank you so much for joining.
Always a pleasure, Andre.
Always a pleasure, especially for having someone with such a I would say a diverse and impactful career like you had within this industry. Thank you
You're
so
too
much.
kind. Thanks for having me.
This episode was sponsored by Peopleware. For more information, please check the first link on